Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 2.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the internet, and welcome back to Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Jazwa, and tonight we will be finally finishing up with our three-part series on the Hidden Hand, with Part 3, The Dark Side, and the Cabal. First off, I just want to apologize for the unexpected delay with this episode. When I set out to try to complete this endeavor, life was fairly normal. Things were going great, actually. And it seemed like right after the first episode went out, things just immediately began falling apart left and right. I'm sure that there's zero correlation or connection between those two events. It's just kind of how it worked out. But from some things going on with my family, to being very close to, unfortunately, losing my absolute best friend in the whole world. If you know me, you know what I'm talking about. It's actually my Bainbridge lab when I was 12 years old. I guess you have to let go at some point, but it's not going to be an easy process, and just trying to take care of him for the past month has been pretty much a full-time job in and of itself, so that has caused delays. He clearly didn't appreciate that. But my business has been pretty crazy, which is a good thing. I mean, I'm definitely very happy for that, but it has been a lot of work to keep up with everything. And also, admittedly, I vastly underestimated how much research was left, how much work and writing it was going to take to try to collate all that into any sort of a meaningful, not even timeline, but just in a narrative that would make sense in any form or fashion, because it's everywhere, it's all over the place, and it's such a vast network, and there's so much to it, so many moving pieces. It's kind of an ever-evolving situation as well, so, and I have to kind of balance, what I think and with what I can prove, because it's very easy to not go far enough, and equally easy to go too far without realizing it. So I did my best to base everything that I'm going to tell you on documents, things that I can back up, preponderance of evidence at the worst case. So we're going to try to be as objective about all of this as possible. But there is a lot to all of this, so that definitely took a lot longer than I realized, and if I had known just how much was left to all of this, I wouldn't have saved it all for this last episode. But not to make excuses, it has been a very difficult undertaking from start to finish. Tonight, though, we will finally reach our conclusion of it, and we have a massive episode to get through, so no more rambling intro, no more excuses. Welcome to Episode 6, Part 3, The Dark Side and the Cabal, Architects of the New World Order. Let's get into it. Welcome back. The fact that you made it this far speaks volumes to your character and your desire to better understand and hopefully resist the system of control which everyone, in the first world at least, has found ourselves trapped under. If you came here right after hearing Part 2, and you were probably wanting to get that dirt on the other people involved in these elite trafficking and pedo blackmail rings, trust me, we will get there pretty soon. We will also go way beyond that to the heart of it all and how it all connects. First though, I need to explain why most of this is probably new to you, and if it's all true, why you don't hear more about it. All of that comes down to two key factors: perception versus reality, and the illusion of choice. Allow me to explain. Most people get their info from the news and media, including books, magazines, internet, movies, TV, newspapers on occasion, and radio. Unfortunately, for us Americans, and most of the world to a greater extent, all of those things are ultimately controlled by 6 mega corporations, whom also control and own the military-industrial complex. Let's break that down just a little, because understanding this is crucial to getting a full picture of how all of these seemingly independent elements do function and move as a single unit. Today, AT&T, Comcast, Disney, Sony, Fox, Paramount, Global, just those control 90% and growing as they consolidate and buy up other companies of everything that you watch, read, or listen to. They spend millions on lobbyists every single year just to manipulate legislation in order to make it work in their favor. Have you ever seen the clips of all the different news stations from all over delivering the exact same narrative the exact same way? Almost like they're reading off the exact same script. That's because these aren't independent news outlets doing real journalism anymore. They're just actors, talking heads, delivering stories from scripts that get handed down to them by some of these few conglomerates. Same with the big tech companies that own all of the social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. They all silence dissent and they censor content that doesn't fit with the narrative or the agenda that's at play. And at this point, that shouldn't really be new news to you, but the interconnected web of media and military is a very long rabbit hole to try to go down. So let's just hit some of the high points, starting with the 2 asset management firms who have controlling interests in all of them. I'm sure you know what I'm about to say here. BlackRock and Vanguard. They own a huge portion of everything from Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. Not to mention being the top 2 owners of Time Warner, Comcast, Disney, and News Corp, which are 4 out of the 6 megacorps who control 90% of the US media landscape. I've spoken several times on this podcast about Operation Mockingbird and the Mockingbird media. That's because a major leg of the cabal is exposed once you factor in the CIA into all of it. During the 1975 Church Committee, the CIA was drugged before Congress to explain many things, while they barely scratched the surface. Everything from MKUltra to Project Mockingbird was briefly brought to light. Former CBS president Sig Mickelson stated in his testimony that the relationships between CBS and the CIA was long established before he ever became president of the network, and that's just one of them. Thinking back to the fact that 90% of our media is controlled by 6, possibly just 3 after all the mergers, corporations, it should be easily understood that you should be careful with readily believing everything you see, hear, or read from the mainstream media. Now that we've established a bit of an info hierarchy, if you will, there's much more to it, trust me, but let's go ahead and take a look at how one of these elite blackmail rings recently played out in the case of Jeffrey Epstein. When former Secretary of Labor Alexander Acosta resigned in disgrace after mounting pressure regarding his role in cutting Epstein a sweetheart deal while serving as a federal prosecutor in Florida, he offered several excuses. One that stood out to me was when he said that he had cut the non-prosecution deal with one of Epstein's attorneys because he had, quote, been told to back off, that Epstein was above his pay grade. Also saying, quote, I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone, end quote. If true, this would call to mind a spycraft tactic as old as time called a honey trap, or a honey pit. A move that dates back at least to the biblical story of Samson and Delilah, if you want to take it back to there, and was used massively during the Cold War. And it's still a favorite of governments around the world to this day. The mafia used similar blackmail traps to control politicians, and even J. Edgar Hoover, the precursor to the CIA, the OSS, began utilizing these sort of traps, but the CIA would be the ones to perfect them, and were certainly the most prolific with them, shall we say. Israeli intelligence, or Mossad, whom Ghislaine Maxwell's father was closely entwined with, and likely offed by, story for another day, like most intelligence agencies, are also big fans of this approach. For those unaware, a honey trap is deployed by finding the secret weakness of a target, something they would die to keep quiet. Sometimes that's drugs, prostitutes, other illegal or immoral activities, and sometimes it's much darker. Think along the lines of the eyes wide shut ritual that we talked about in part 2. And by arranging or tempting the target to partake in these activities while secretly recording or photographing them in order to use this evidence as blackmail if the target refuses to comply or to fall into line. As compelling as all of that is, and as much as I would love to just be able to tie this up in a neat little bow by telling you that this was the case with Epstein, you should know me well enough by now to know that I have to get to the heart of the things and dig. I need proof, documents, or at least a preponderance of supporting evidence. As far as I can tell, while he may have been used by the CIA, he wasn't at any point directly employed or working for them. The CIA, however, is just a cog in a much bigger wheel anyway. So let's see what else we do know about him based on the client list and court documents. When you really dig into everything, one name will come up over and over, that being one Leslie, or Lex, Herbert Wexner. Wexner is an American billionaire who started with the Limited Clothing Store, which he originally launched in 1963. He did so from a loan from his aunt, and he put that with a bank loan, basically, both of them totaling about $5,000. He would go on to grow the brand to astronomical heights, before acquiring Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, White Barn Candle Company, Abercrombie & Fitch, and a very long list of others, amassing billions. Wexner would hire Epstein as his, quote, financial manager from 1987 to 2007 and become his primary client. In July of 1991, Wexner granted Epstein power of attorney over his affairs, and even instated him as a trustee on the board of the Wexner Foundation. Wexner even allowed Epstein to run his operations out of a home that he owned and lived in while he was the CEO of Victoria's Secret, and various other residences, including the largest private mansion in New York City, which he sold to Epstein for the whopping sum of, hold on, brace yourself, $1. One whole dollar. Wexner has a bit of very suspicious connections aside from Epstein as well. President George W. Bush appointed Wexner to serve in the honorary delegation to accompany him to Jerusalem for the 60th anniversary of the Rothschild-funded State of Israel in May of 2008, and was a major political contributor to the Bush family dynasty. As recent as 2015, old Leslie cut a $500,000 check to Jeb Bush for his failed 2016 election run. And Wexner's wife, Abigail, is also a major contributor to them. Wexner has a close relationship with the State of Israel and provided money and PR support to build the case for the Iraq War. To understand Epstein's role in everything, Wexner is one of the big keys to that. In 1991, along with Charles Bronfman, Wexner founded the Mega Group, with the stated purpose of adding greater clout to the Israeli lobby by establishing an informal but all-powerful policy-making group able to deploy billions of dollars in charitable funds for the maximum effect on U.S. policy towards Israel, the Middle East, and other issues of great importance to the Jewish mega-billionaire class. The Megacorp is one of many powerful sub-organizations within the greater Cabal network that influence global policy. They meet twice a year in secret closed-door 2-day sessions to make life and death decisions affecting U.S. policy. Membership is invite-only, and its existence is kept quiet, and each of its 20 to 50 members pay $30,000 apiece in annual dues to cover the cost of their twice-a-year meetings. It probably goes without saying that this group of hand-picked Jewish billionaires aren't interested in charitable works or bringing peace to the Middle East. According to the March 13, 2001 dispatch from the Jewish Telegraph Agency, the Megacorp was expected to contribute $7 million to the Orwellian-named think tank, Emmet, Hebrew for truth, that they hoped would, quote, generate long-term strategies for presenting Israel in a favorable light, end quote. which was a goal of the newly installed Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who wanted a two-pronged offensive geared towards winning U.S. support of his plans to overturn the Middle East peace process. 9/11 would, of course, provide plenty of the propaganda needed to derail peace in the region for decades to come. If the Zionists and the neocons had one thing that they firmly agreed on, it was that peace is bad for business. Back to Epstein, though. The mansion that was essentially gifted to Epstein by Wexner came already fully tricked out with state-of-the-art surveillance and hidden cameras in every room. Basically, a lavishly designed honey trap house, custom-made for producing sexual blackmail ammo. Wexner bugged his own house and gave it to Epstein. He also gave him the private jet that would come to be known better as the Lolita Express, where teenage girls would be sold and abused. Wexner basically created Epstein. If a politician, general, congressman, occasionally celebrity, or even president didn't want to play ball, it was Epstein and Maxwell's job to set them up and compromise them. Wexner was effectively Epstein's boss and handler, but Wexner is still just one small piece in a much bigger picture. Epstein was a pawn on the board, nothing more, and he was sacrificed as soon as his dealings reached a point that they could no longer be covered up and swept under the rug. He knew far too much, though, about too many people, which leads us to August 10th, 2019, when against a laughable amount of odds, Epstein would be found unresponsive in his cell in a kneeling position with a strip of bedsheet around his neck. I could do an entire episode on all the inconsistencies and complete impossibilities that clearly spell out that his death, or supposed death according to some hardcore conspiracy circles, was anything but self-inflicted. For the sake of time, and to get past this one small piece of our very large puzzle a little quicker, I'll save that for another time. Hit me up in the Q&A if you want me to cover that whole story, or, if enough people are interested, I'll be glad to get into it sometime. Regardless, Epstein had to go away. He was connected too high up and knew far too much. He was also at one time a member of the CFR, as well as the Trilateral Commission, two more groups that we will discuss shortly that are a part of the larger picture and overall control matrix. Epstein wasn't an anomaly, though. People just like him exist in elevated positions across a wide range of industries, and I would suspect, though at this point I can only allege, that if the whole truth emerges about the diddler, aka Puffy Cheesecakes, that we will learn of another of these individuals just like Epstein, who helps to control the music industry as well as parts of Hollywood and the fashion industry. I'll give you one more little breadcrumb on that for now, though, for, entertainment purposes, shall we say. As Wexner was to Epstein, Lucian Grange is to Diddy. And Diddy is just the very, very tiny little tip of a much, much bigger iceberg. As powerful as Lucian is, he is yet another cog in this wheel, albeit a larger one who is decidedly smarter in his actions and better insulated from accusations and litigation through his position as the CEO of Universal Music Group. A name you probably aren't that familiar with is Ethiopia Hebdomerium, but I would encourage you to make a mental note of it, as she is allegedly the Ghislaine Maxwell, whatever, of the Diddy blackmail racket. So the question is, why do so many of these wicked blackmail pedophile rings even exist? Is it simply a way for people who crave power and control to gain more of those things, and each one is just an isolated case of an individual using this very old method to bend others to their will? Or is it something deeper than that? While it's certainly possible that countless evil, power-driven individuals just all figured out this technique and decided to use it on their own without any outside influence, the fact that it seems to pop up over and over and across a vast and varied range of industries and social circles, and throughout a very long timeline, seems to point more towards this being a part of a blueprint, if you will, a piece of a much larger agenda, and yet another control matrix, utilized by a group with intentions to gain control and influence over as much of the world as they possibly can. On April 27, 1961, a little less than 7 months before his assassination, John F. Kennedy gave a speech before the American Newspaper Publishers Association. It is widely considered among those who, enjoy conspiracy and sort of study his assassination, and commonly referred to as the speech that got JFK killed. I have other thoughts on that matter. That I may share those in the BTR if I remember to, but let me know if you're interested in that. It's a fairly famous speech that you may have heard. I just want to play a quick little snippet of it for you now, just for the sake of context.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
That's the part that pretty much everybody always plays. They take that little clip, and that's what most of you have probably only ever heard out of that whole speech. And while it would be easy to take those words out of context, as countless many other before me have done, and to bend it to fit this narrative by saying that he was trying to warn us about Freemasons or the Cabal way back then, that would be both dishonest and disingenuous, considering that I know the truth. The truth is, of course, that he was referring to communism, and furthermore, the point of that speech was actually to encourage the national press to keep secrets, and not to expose matters of national security to the Soviets or to Cuba. So why even bring that up then? Just to point it out that there is an endless amount of BS out there about what we are about to get into. And for those unaware of how, or unwilling to truly dig and do the work to extract the facts from everything, and then to rigorously double and triple check those facts, it's easy to either dismiss it all as false or convince yourself that it's reality, but based on inaccurate information, and misunderstand the true scope of the situation. And if that is the only part of that speech that you've ever heard, I would strongly encourage you to take the time to go and actually look that speech up and listen to it in its entirety, and not just that little choice clip from, the middle of it there. Still, a quick conspiracy-minded search will bring up page after page after page quoting this speech and saying that it's about the Cabal. Tons of people, well-meaning and intelligent people, still believe that it is. So needless to say, this has been quite the undertaking. I have, however, I feel, managed to piece together a large portion of the bigger picture. I've done my absolute best to weed out the misinformation, all of those seemingly true breadcrumbs left with the specific intentions to mislead or even to discredit any who would dare to seek and expose the truth. This has been a significant hurdle for a countless many people before me, from the rare intrepid reporter with the balls to actually seek and speak the truth, to a long line of independent researchers and, quote, conspiracy theorists, which has served to not only obfuscate the truth, but discourage any future attempts at revealing it. With that said, I've managed to put together a list of the primary organizations that work in lockstep to control global policy, undermine national sovereignty, subvert the efforts of anyone who would dare work towards innovations that would better the lives of the people without benefiting them. Part 2. The Cabal Iceberg. Ahem. Political parties exist to secure responsible government and to execute the will of the people. From these great tasks, both of the old parties have turned aside. Instead of instruments to promote the general welfare, they have become the tools of corrupt interests which use them impartially to serve their selfish purposes. Behind the ostensible government sits enthroned an invisible government, owing no allegiance and acknowledging no responsibility to the people. To destroy this invisible government, to dissolve the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics, is the first task of the statesman of the day. That was the words of Theodore Roosevelt. And however well-intentioned he, like all who would follow, might be, he failed miserably in that endeavor. To vastly simplify the pyramid of control, I would say that if you imagine a pyramid, they really love those anyway, then we are at the very bottom. The masses. We make up the foundation that holds all of the weight. Above us is the government. Above them is the major corporations, the corporatocracy, if you will. Above them are the banks, which is where the corporatocracy gets all of its funding, to pay lobbyists and to buy politicians, and all at special rates, mind you, just for them. If you follow the money up a little further, it means above them are the national central banks, and then the international central banks. Of course, like the IMF and World Bank. Above them, though, is the central bank of all central banks, the Bank for International Settlements. At the very top of the pyramid sit the financial elite, the Rothschilds, for example, the Rockefellers. All mainstream media networks are owned and controlled by 5 or less. This research was hindered greatly by the shell game of companies, owning corporations, owning foundations, owning corporations, multinational corporations, and all 5 have connections back to either the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, or both, which is why we started this journey discussing those guys. One of the primary ways that corporations control our government, in the US anyway, is through an organization that many people probably haven't even heard of called ALEC, A-L-E-C, which stands for American Legislative Exchange Council, and it's comprised of state legislators and corporate leaders that allows corporations to essentially just write and then hand over, in many cases, legislation beneficial to their interests, to the lawmakers, for them to take credit for it and to formally propose it. As bad as all this is, and that's just the financial markets, money supply and well-known corporate control of our so-called democratic government. This, in the grand scheme of things, is insignificant surface-level type stuff. We have much deeper to dig down the proverbial rabbit hole. I've also intentionally stayed away from the complete capture of our food supply by chemical companies and the almost unbelievable web that spins off of all of that, because it definitely deserves a full episode at some point. For now, let's look at the better known and understood, somewhat at least, pieces of the greater control matrix. For these upper parts of this iceberg, I can really only speak to the US entities. And I mean, this took me long enough to piece together. As you're no doubt noticed by the giant gap that we had in episodes there, again, very sorry. And to try and compile such a list for every single country would probably take me the better part of a lifetime. As we work our way down, we will be discussing more and more the groups that influence the world as a whole. So let's start off with level 1, the enforcement branch. While it's really hard to say that any of these pieces is particularly more important than any other, for the sake of getting through this material and keeping it somewhat organized, I'll have to somewhat do just that. What's important to realize, however, is that it is all truly more of an interwoven web, all working together to reinforce the other parts of it, spanning out to ensnare all of us. Starting off with 1, the police forces. Now, my father worked in law enforcement for over 20 years, and I understand and truly appreciate the work that they do in many cases. I absolutely understand their necessity, and this should not be mistaken or misunderstood as all police officers are evil, or defund the police, or that most cops get into this line of work for nefarious reason type thing. This isn't about the beat cops or even the detectives. In most cases, I'm not even talking about the sergeants or the captains, or sheriffs for that matter. It's about the order as a whole and how it has been subverted over the last 50 or 60 years or so to serve an agenda. This is about the militarization of these forces and to completely undermine the Posse Comitatus Act and to effectively give those in power another army to specifically target the U.S. population and to help carry out their agendas. After all, what is a control matrix without the threat of physical violence when all else fails? Bear in mind the police are, after all, a fraternal order, which is by its very definition a secret society, one with initiation rituals, a call of brotherhood, unity, and self-preservation above others at its core. This is why the quote good cop who tries to root out corruption and abuse within the force is typically not only unsuccessful, but generally ousted, despised, or even met with career and in several citable cases, life-ending outcomes. Number 2. The FBI, ATF, DEA, and federal law enforcement as a whole. A step up, or down I suppose if we're still sticking with the iceberg analogy, from the frontline enforcers. While the OSS and later CIA was designed to focus outward to find threats, they don't and never really did, but we'll get to that in a minute. The FBI was specifically created to focus on internal threats and to monitor the public in varying degrees, though not quite near the level of the other agencies created specifically for that purpose, but we'll also get there here in just a bit too. They still have done their fair share of domestic spying over the years and quite effectively becoming exactly the secret police force in the vein of the Gestapo that Congress had feared that they would turn into since their creation. Since most people probably don't know that much at all about them and how it all started, I feel it's important to fully understanding the truth about them to go through some of it. And I'm admittedly a bit of a history nerd too, so just allow me to quickly bring you all up to speed on that story. I promise not to get too sidetracked and to summarize and condense as best that I can, but in short, FDR felt that there was a need for a federal detective force. I won't get bogged down in his motivations about all that. It's a long story too. But in 1907, he asked Congress to create one, seeing how that could easily be misused, come off the rails, and citing the public's long-held disdain from all-powerful federal law enforcement agency, they would shoot him down. And they would even go a step further by passing legislation specifically prohibiting the Justice Department from using investigators from any other federal agencies. This wouldn't last long, however, because in 1908, Roosevelt would use an executive order to create the Bureau of Investigation and directed then AG Charles Bonaparte. Fun fact, his grandfather was Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, to develop the agency within the DOJ. This would lead to several clashes between FDR and Congress, whose fear of them being little more than a secret police would gain even more traction when in 1909 it was discovered agents from the Bureau had regularly been opening the mail of one of their most vocal opponents in Senator Benjamin Tillman. This sort of activity, political meddling and acting like the Gestapo of the managerial state, essentially, has only escalated over the years. It would be impossible to condense down the very long list of misdeeds perpetrated by the agency over the years, and no doubt do a great disservice to explaining the true weight and magnitude of their corruption and downright wicked dealings. Still, here's just a few items that, mind you, don't come anywhere remotely close to a fraction of just the things they've been caught doing for you to consider or look further into should you feel so inclined. Blackmailing of high-level politicians and even presidents, COINTELPRO, Waco, Ruby Ridge, illegal wiretapping. That time, May 3rd, 2015 to be precise, in Garland, Texas, that an agent traveled with a group of terrorists for days, hyped them up, provided them with assistance, and helped them to plan out the act, and then attempted to flee the scene of a mass shooting right before it could happen. And had a local off-duty cop not intervened, it would have been yet another mass shooting where the agency was in direct contact with the gunman, assisted or facilitated the act, or had prior knowledge and simply allowed it to happen, which for the record is a very, very long list, and even involves several acts of domestic terrorism, one of which we discussed last season. To spare your time and sanity, I won't even get into it. Or get into J. Edgar Hoover and all the dastardly and downright bizarre crap that guy got up to while he was at the helm. Number 3. the ATF. And I know I didn't remotely come close, as I said I wouldn't, to even scratching the very top of a piece of the surface regarding the FBI, but we would seriously be here all night to just do the surface scratching, and to be totally honest, I'd rather not die for it like many before me have. One agency that has worked closely with them, and has been a part of several of their darker hours, is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and also explosives, but as we all know, they love their three-letter acronyms. From Waco to OKC, these guys have served as another heavily armed governmental hit squad. Not to fully dismiss the good work that some of them have surely done, though I'm really struggling to think of an example here. Over their years in operation, they have most assuredly done plenty of very, very bad. If they were half as big as the FBI, they may even be worse, to be honest. One quick example, aside from what I've already mentioned, would be when they shut the power off to a home in Little Rock in the wee hours of the morning belonging to Brian Malinowski before a small army of agents, none wearing body cameras, and covered the security cameras of his home as well, and then kicked down his front door, and 57 seconds later, fatally shot him in the head before dragging his wife out in her bedclothes and held her in the back of a squad car in 34-degree weather for 4 hours, ignoring her desperate pleas to check on her dying husband, or to even let her use the restroom. While the media painted this story as a clear-cut, justified raid and shooting, and frequently repeated the story that agents had knocked and announced themselves before entering the home, and that Brian had fired on officers before being shot, there is quite a bit more to the story, and it is far more nuanced than they made it sound. Malinowski had no criminal record and no knowledge he was even under surveillance at the time. This was, in fact, a no-knock raid, as it would later be revealed in court, despite a directive being issued by Deputy AG Lisa Monaco, limiting the use of this tactic to only the most necessary of circumstances 2 years prior to this. He was a respected airport manager and sold guns part-time at gun shows as a hobby. He wasn't El Chapo. They could have simply served the warrant in the correct manner and given him a chance to comply rather than busting his door down as 10 vehicles full of agents in full SWAT gear entered and surrounded his home while he was asleep. He shot at the ground in front of the men, yes, that he couldn't even see, and he was hoping to scare them out of his home and to defend his family, apparently striking one of them in the foot in the process, which is what led to him being fatally shot in the head. When the ATF was called before Congress to explain themselves, Representative Kelly Armstrong pointed out that, quote, somebody made a leadership decision in order to execute a search warrant in the most dangerous way possible, adding, they chose to implement a warrant in a way that absolutely maximized the risk of harm both to the person being served the warrant and to the officer serving the warrant. This was just the most recent example that came to my mind while I was writing this. The sad truth is, the ATF has a long and storied history of controversial, ill-conceived, dangerous, and frankly totalitarian actions. But let's move on. We have a lot to still cover, so going forward I'm going to try and keep it a little more brief for those of you who haven't already fallen asleep out there anyway, or tuned out on me yet. I appreciate you. There are a few more of these Stasi-esque agencies out there, but those are two of the biggest offenders. Let's go ahead and just move on at this point to level 2, Big Brother. Suppose I could also call this section the intelligence apparatus. While the FBI could certainly be considered a part of this branch as well, that wasn't why they were created, supposedly anyway, and it isn't their primary function at least. While most people probably only think of the CIA or maybe the NSA when talking about the US intelligence apparatus, it is actually far more expansive and infinitely more convoluted than that. Let's just start with the top dog, the ODNI. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI, integrates and coordinates the activities of the entire intelligence community and directs and oversees the whole national intelligence program. It's a relatively new office and position that came about thanks to all of the domestic spying upgrades that the IC received in the wake of 9/11. Directly under them, it's honestly a bit of a toss-up between the CIA and the NSA depending on the source, but we'll go with the CIA, or of course Central Intelligence Agency, who needs no introduction. Longtime listeners of this pod will be more than aware of their almost unbelievably long track record of foul undertakings. Although they were conceived in 1942 as the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, to coordinate espionage activities behind enemy lines, foreign intelligence gathering, and to be the U.S. equivalent of the British MI6 essentially, by gathering, processing, and analyzing national security info from around the world, the scope of their activities and methods of their operations would quickly shift and morph into something far, far worse. Since this is another topic that I could go on about for weeks probably without hitting the highlights even, I'll spare you the time. Here's just a couple of examples that I can think of off the top of my head. Domestic wiretapping, Operation Mockingbird, MK Ultra, Extraordinary Rendition, all of the black sites that they operate, Operation Condor, Iran-Contra affair, Operation Bloodstone, drug trafficking in mass quantities, the multiple times that they've lied to Congress, coups in the Democratic Republic of Congo, coups in Iran, attempted coups in Cuba, Bay of Pigs fiasco. Really, this list goes on and on and on and on and on. So, for now, we'll move on to the next topic. Speaking of wiretapping, next up we have the National Security Agency, or the NSA, is the primary domestic spying apparatus against U.S. citizens. Its beginnings was as a unit to decipher coded communications during World War II, though its existence was kept top secret. So secret that a running joke was that NSA stood for no such agency, and until 9/11 the majority of the U.S. public was completely unaware of its existence even. Until the revelations made by Edward Snowden in 2013, the public at large had little to no idea of exactly how hard Big Brother was truly watching. Aside from the NSA, CIA, and FBI, there are actually at least 14 other U.S. intelligence agencies officially in operation as of today. The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, is up next, which was a direct result of the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which was passed, of course, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the contrived anthrax attacks that we discussed back in part 3 of the 9/11 series last season. It's another sprawling organization and acts as a DoD for matters within the U.S. Expect to hear and see more from them in the near future. We'll just say that. And with that, we're going to move on to level 3, the shadow groups. There are far more of these organizations than I could hope to truly ever cover here in very much depth, but I do want to attempt to at least get into some of them. So let's kick it off with some you will be at least more familiar with, and then we'll work our way towards the more obscure ones. And as obscure and difficult of a, ranking system as that is, to rank these any other way would be nearly impossible, because many of them overlap, have public and private personas, and are made up of some of the most powerful people. There are also several ways to look at things and evidence that speaks to each of them having a claim to being the most powerful group. The truth is more complex, more nuanced, but we will get there. Number 1, the United Nations. Few global organizations have had the level of influence and notoriety of the UN, a diplomatic and political international organization. The largest one, actually, was established shortly after World War II with the stated purpose of preventing future wars, and is essentially the replacement for the League of Nations which preceded it. The UN Charter was adopted on June 25, 1945 and took effect on August 24, 1945, starting with 51 member states. By 2023, it had grown to include 193 of them, or the world's most sovereign nations. While long dismissed as just a conspiracy theory, the UN's Agenda 21 plan, or how they feel humans should live and will live in the 21st century, has not only come to be proven as fact, but has been updated with even more frightening directives. Agenda 21 really goes back to the 70s and to the Club of Rome. More on those guys in just a sec. But got its real start in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, where they would lay out 21 directives for member nations to implement by the turn of the century. And I started with the UN because by tracing how this all came to be, we'll end up covering basically the who's who of who really runs the world. properly do this, though, we have to go back to something called the Bank of the United States, which operated from 1816 until 1836, before being abolished by President Andrew Jackson, who believed that an American central bank would be a grave threat to the nation. Boy, was he right. Which he made clear when he wrote, quote, "The bold effort the present bank has made to control the government, the distresses it had wantonly produced, are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." End quote. His efforts would unfortunately be short-lived, however, when a particular meeting at Jekyll Island would soon alter the nation's future for good. In November of 1910, 7 of the most wealthy and influential men met in top secret at the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia, with a mission to reform the U.S. banking systems and to resurrect the central bank. Participants wouldn't admit this meeting ever taking place for over 20 more years. The 7 were comprised of Nelson W. Aldrich, father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Henry P. Davidson, senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company, A. Platt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at the time, Benjamin Strong, who was the head of J.P. Morgan Bankers Trust Company, Paul M. Warburg, who was representing the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, Charles D. Norton, the president of the First National Bank of New York, and Frank A. Vandercliff, representing William Rockefeller. The goal was simple: to create a single central bank under their family's control and to take complete control of the nation's money supply, which they did in 1913 when President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. Now, a few families fully controlled the vast majority of the world's wealth. While technically unconstitutional, the Congress shall have power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. That coming from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, I believe. The Federal Reserve Act undid all of that. As Charles Lindbergh put it in his warning to Congress, quote, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth," going on to say that the invisible government by the money power proven to exist by the money trust investigation will be legalized. Or even Congressman Louis McFadden, the House Committee Banking and Currency Chairman from 1920 to 1931, who said, quote, "When the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the people of the United States did not perceive that a world banking system was being set up, a superstate controlled by international bankers and industrialists acting together to enslave the world. Every effort has been made by the Fed to conceal its powers, but the truth is the Fed has usurped the government." End quote. As most of us know by now, the Federal Reserve is no more a part of the federal government than Federal Express, and it's owned by private member banks and beholden to absolutely no one, not even oversight by Congress or the President. They print money and therefore print debt from thin air, paying the Bureau of Engraving and Printing $23 for each 1,000 notes. In other words, $1 million created would cost the Fed about $230 to generate, and then secure a pledge of collateral equal to the face value of those notes from our government. That collateral, ladies and gentlemen, is of course our land, labor, and assets collected by their goon squad, the IRS, allowing them to create profits at will and keep the U.S. in a perpetual and unpayable state of unending debt. This is why you pay income tax. Something, by the way, that was ruled unconstitutional in 1895 by the Supreme Court, thus requiring an amendment proposed by none other than Fed co-creator Senator Nelson Aldrich, father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, which, for the record, was sold to the people as a graduated tax with only 1% being paid by those with income under $20,000, or today's equivalent would be $634,483, with the lion's share supposedly going to be paid by the very wealthy. Of course, they had other plans, which we won't go into here, but they have ways of protecting their wealth. Back to the UN, though. As I just laid out, our money begins as debt, and it's just one of many tools used by the elites to control and enslave the population. The ultimate goal of these families is total control over the human race through a central government beholden only to them. They like to use the term New World Order. While it's become as cliche as the Illuminati itself, there are countless examples of them using this term themselves. They are achieving this aim through centralization. The more you centralize, the more you concentrate power into fewer and fewer hands. This is why we have seen such a rise in globalism and so much power being slowly shifted into the hands of unelected globalist organizations. The next phase of this, which is already going on behind the scenes, and if you follow me or my work at all, as I've been saying, among many others willing to be honest with you, they want a central world bank and a single unified digital currency. NATO is the first incarnation, along with UN peacekeepers, of a one-world military army to enforce policy. If you've been paying attention, then you should be at least starting to see how this all coalescing and comes together. Along with the UN, you have lesser-known organizations also working towards these ends, like the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, to direct policy changes in that direction. Realizing that America wouldn't willingly join any world governance schemes without some sort of a change in public opinion, a series of meetings were held. From those, it was decided that an Institute for International Affairs would be needed with a U.S. and British branch. The British one would become known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, with leadership provided by Cecil Rhodes' Roundtable Group. In America, we would of course get the CFR, and on July 29th of 1921 in New York, it would be incorporated. Members would include such known names as J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Paul Warburg, Otto Kahn, and Jacob Schiff. The founding president was John W. Davis, J.P. Morgan's personal attorney. Over time, Morgan would lose control of the group to the Rockefellers. Let me, as quickly as possible, just try to illustrate how this interconnected web actually functions. During the 20s, the U.S. enjoyed a decade of great prosperity, driven to these heights by the easy availability of credit. From 23 to 29, the Fed increased the money supply by 62%. When the stock market crash happened, many smaller investors were completely destroyed or driven out. In March of 29, Paul Warburg issued a tip that the crash was imminent, leading the bigger investors to go ahead and pull out and save themselves. With their wealth still intact, they were able to buy up companies at a fraction of their worth, and the buying power and wealth of the rich grew from this tremendously. As our friend Louis McFadden put it, quote, "It was not accidental, it was a carefully contrived occurrence," also stating, quote, "The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as rulers of us all," end quote. The crash was completely orchestrated, in other words, which paved the way for the man the bankers most wanted in the presidential office, FDR, sold as a, quote, "man of the little people." He was in reality anything but that. And the Roosevelt family had been involved in New York banking since the 18th century. Curtis Dell, FDR's son-in-law, would later write in his 1967 book, FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law, that, quote, "most of his thoughts, his political ammunition, were carefully manufactured for him in advance by the CFR, One World Money Group. Brilliantly, he exploded that prepared ammunition in the middle of an unsuspecting target, the American people, and thus paid off and retained his internationalist political support," end quote. FDR would take the country off the gold standard in 1934. Technically, he started that process. Nixon finished it off, but story for another day. One of our greatest mistakes as a nation, opening the way to unrestricted money supply expansion, raising gold prices from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce. FDR and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., son of one of the founding CFR members, would hand massive profits to the international bankers. His most remembered program, the New Deal, was financed through a whole lot of heavy borrowing. So basically, the same ones who triggered the Great Depression would turn around and loan America the money to recover from it. During his presidency, the CFR would slowly capture the politicians around him. Aside from Morgenthau, Secretary of State Edward Stettnis, War Secretary Henry Stimson, and Assistant Secretary of the State Sumner Welles Since then, nearly every single Secretary of State has been a member, along with every single Secretary of War or Defense from Stimson through Richard Cheney. Another founding member of the CFR was Allen Dulles, the first civilian director of the CIA and brother of Secretary of State under Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles. Allen would later become CFR president. John Foster was also a founding member, an in-law of the Rockefellers, chairman of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, as well as board chairman for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Since then, nearly all U.S. presidents and most of their opponents have been CFR members. Truman, who was an exception, was still advised by his group of wise men, all 6 of whom were, yes, you guessed it, CFR members. The UN is truly a creation of the CFR, and it's headquartered on land donated by one-time CFR chairman David Rockefeller. The American delegation that helped draft its charter included Nelson Rockefeller, John Foster Dulles, John McCloy, and 44 other CFR members, essentially deciding the outcome and ensuring that it went to plan. Since then, the CFR has gone on to be one of the most influential voices in determining and controlling American economic, social, political, and military policies. Among its current board of directors is a veritable who's who of international business and banking, as well as politicians, not to mention heads of major news and media organizations. A very abbreviated list of just its board of directors includes such known names as Afsani Beshlis, the founder and CEO of Rock Creek, partner at Carlyle Group, and treasurer/chief investment officer of the World Bank, former Defense Secretary Ash Carter, Caesar Conde, the chairman of NBC Universal News Group, Larry Fink, the chairman and CEO of none other than BlackRock, Tim Gaithner, the president and director of Warburg Pincus, and former New York Fed president Janet Napolitano, the former Department of Homeland Security secretary, as well as heads of Google, HBO, Alphabet, MIT, and many more. Number 3, our next group, as we continue to dig deeper down this iceberg and further down the rabbit hole, is the Club of Rome. Founded in 1968 in Rome, Italy, hence the name, it consists of 100 full members, hand-selected from current and former heads of state and government, UN administrators, high-level politicians, government officials, diplomats, influential scientists, economists, and business people from all over the world. It would first truly appear on the world stage with its first report in 1972's The Limits to Growth, where it would begin to propagate the idea and stoke the fear of the imminent dangers we face from overpopulation and the need to reduce global population. And they would later put forth a report titled Regionalized Adaptive Model of the Global World System, part of their Strategy for Survival project, stating the goal of submerging the nation-states into 10 global regions for the administrative convenience of a world government. Global 2000, a U.S. policy document, was published in 1979 and was very similar to the Limits to Growth report, pushing fears of overpopulation while calling for an intensively managed world and fertility reduction in order to help lower the, quote, population problem. I mentioned the Royal Institute of International Affairs being the British counterpart to the CFR a moment ago, and just to give you a small insight into their line of logic and intentions, Arnold Toynbee, director of studies there, when addressing these issues, is quoted in a law review as saying, quote, "In all developed countries, a new way of life, a severely regimented way, will have to be imposed by a ruthless authoritarian government," end quote. Many of these people have put forth plans to massively reduce global population, with some policy think tanks calling for as much as an 80% reduction in global population. Very much along the lines of the Georgia Guidestones. Without getting too distracted by their elitist and borderline psychotic views that they hold and espouse with virtually zero empirical evidence to support them, most of their concerns with population comes down to their Malthusian modeling of exponential growth versus finite resources. The problem we are facing, though, in reality, isn't that we lack resources, it's that we are being greatly limited in our access to those resources by the excess, greed, and hoarding tendencies of the exact ultra-wealthy psychopaths that largely comprise such groups as the Club of Rome and other think tanks like them. Anyone who is willing to go by the actual numbers, rather than being driven by the irrational fear that there isn't enough to satisfy their insatiable greed without killing off all of us useless eaters first and dramatically reducing global population, will also come to the far more logical realization that, at least within the first world countries, we are far closer to facing a massive population shortage, or die-off. Far more people these days are choosing to either have less children over financial concerns or not to even reproduce at all. Global population is already in a significant decline, whether that's purely due to economic strain, a direct result of their efforts, or the efforts of others like them, i.e. Bill Gates, or a combination of both is really yet to be determined. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now, or at least I'm going to try to be for a while, so let's keep going. I suppose the point of the Club of Rome, or one of them at least, is to push policy decisions in the direction of depopulation, one of the big goals of the Cabal. A smaller population is easier to manage and completely control, as well as less likely to be able to put up any sort of meaningful resistance or rebellion, of course. One of the last remaining elements we have on our side at this point is the simple fact that regardless of how neutered and indoctrinated many people are these days, we do still have the numbers. We are also still useful slaves. Now, once technology reaches that tipping point where AI and machines can do most of everything that they need, I fear that we may not be so lucky for that much longer. Story for another day. While there are countless organizations in the vein of these which exist outside of government but have a heavy-handed influence over them, it's way too extensive a list to properly cover. There are over 25,000 non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, active around the world today, each with varying levels of involvement in the big picture and varying degrees of nefarious intentions. Many seemingly with none at all, but some are truly the worst enemies of the people. Such is the case with our final group, the World Economic Forum, or WEF. Of all international NGOs, think tanks, and lobbying groups, of which it is all three, there are none with the power, money, and global scope of the WEF. If there was a single global boogeyman to point to, they would definitely be a strong candidate. The WEF was started in 1971 in Geneva, Switzerland by German engineer turned global policymaker and kingmaker and architect of the Great Reset himself, Klaus Schwab. Their stated agenda is improving the state of the world by engaging business, political, academic, and other leaders of society to shape global, regional, and industrial agendas. If that doesn't make the hair stand up on your arms a little bit, then you probably haven't been paying enough attention. They believe in a globalist world, managed and guided by a self-selected coalition of multinational corporations, governments, and organizations, and expresses these aims through initiatives like the Great Reset and global redesign, and views periods of global instability, like the 07-08 financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, as windows of opportunity to accelerate and intensify its programmatic efforts. All of that info, by the way, coming directly from their own website and media team. This is truly how they operate. On the surface, mind you, and they make no bones about it. They're perhaps best known for their annual stuffy version of Bohemian Grove, where over 3,000 of the wealthiest and most powerful people get together along with presidents, prime ministers, and other political leaders, economists, celebrities, and select journalists for up to 5 days to discuss and shape global policy and address issues across typically about 500 sessions. This meeting takes place in Davos, in the Eastern Alps region of Switzerland, and is tightly controlled and well fortified. They are a global group that view themselves as truly international and have little to no need for national loyalty, viewing boundaries as obstacles and governments as relics of the past, ones that function only to facilitate the elite's global operations and initiatives. If you simply study just the public information that has been put forth from them, it quickly becomes undeniably clear that there is an overarching theme they are after, and it is nothing short of the total control of humanity by way of the media, science, and technology to influence the public while reshaping democracies in order to form a global government controlled solely by the elite. As unbelievable and absurd as that sounds, as much as it reeks of another crazy conspiracy theory, And as much as I genuinely set out with the intent of debunking exactly these sorts of ideas in favor of giving you all an honest and realistic take on how power operates, how shared interest and not global conspiracies were truly the unifying element behind how it all seems to work in unison, this is where the research leads. No mental gymnastics or leaps in logic required to see it. And as much as I'm sure most of you, and myself included, would like to believe otherwise, this is the undeniable facts of the situation. I could go through a ridiculously extensive list of examples from their own writings and statements, all publicly available, to support that statement. But this is already far longer than I ever intended it to be. If I have time and there's enough interest in it, I'll be glad to go way more in depth in some sort of extra addendum for all of this, just for them. Though frequently credited to Klaus Schwab, who has no doubt reinforced and amplified the idea, perhaps the best way to summarize the desired outcome for the masses, should the WEF have their way, is the quote, "You'll own nothing and you'll be happy." A phrase from a 2016 video put out by the WEF summarizing an essay that was written for the forum's use by Danish politician and unapologetic globalist Ida Auken in reference to everything shifting to a shared services, subscription-based model in his essay originally titled, "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." Nothing dystopic about that at all. They would later change the title to "Here's How Life Could Change in My City by the Year 2030, a year that it would appear has been earmarked by several organizations, i.e. the UN's Agenda 2030, to be the pivotal point where their efforts are set to reach a crescendo and culmination of multiple initiatives, plans, and, for the lack of a better term, conspiracies come together. While the WF claims that they want to improve the state of the world, it would seem they are only meaning for a very particular portion of that world, particularly the top 1%. For the sake of time, attention span, and not continuing to bore you all by breaking each one down, and of course to get to our overall point, here is the list of the other most powerful INGOs and NGOs in this category in no particular order. The World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, NATO, UNICEF, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, IMF, UNESCO, World Wildlife Fund, Food and Agricultural Organization, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, AIG, or American International Group. To be clear, several of these are just part of this massive web unto itself that is the UN, and not all of these are particularly nefarious in any significant way. They are simply the ones with the greatest amount of influence and power. From all that we've learned about this level of our iceberg, it's pretty clear that the aims of the ones we touched on in depth are to unify global governance under the control of the elite and unelected bodies to control and reduce global population, to consolidate wealth and power into fewer and fewer hands, and to dictate world policy wherever it's possible. They are the agenda makers, and use their massive wealth and influence to subvert democracy, undermine national and personal sovereignty and autonomy, and compel countries into compliance with their desires, or even more accurately put, the desires of the globalist elite. Level 4. Secret Societies and the Occult. Finally, we find ourselves right back where we began, with secret societies. Let's start with the more open ones that could easily slip in under the INGO. Side note, I feel like I'm working my way through the bingo song, literally every time I say that. Title, If They Tried Hard Enough, and weren't quite so, secret. One of the most influential of these, in an open sense, on global policy, finance, and business, is the Bilderberg Group. Bilderberg was formed in 1954 at the Hotel de Bilderberg in Oosterbeek, Netherlands, with the stated purpose of fostering dialogue between Europe and North America. Many of its invitees are the same political leaders, quote, experts, captains of industry, finance, and academia found on the CFR and WEF member list, but exclusively the upper crust of those, and typically only between 120 and 150 people total. The security is even tighter than the WEF, and the press is not invited at all, though a few of their CEOs have been known to attend. Typically, at least 1/3 of the attendees are political figures from presidents to kings and queens. This is essentially where world leaders and corporate interests come together to speak candidly and, as many people believe, make major policy decisions and collude annually about the year ahead. The transnational power elite, if you will, meet behind closed and tightly guarded doors, and if that reeks of a political form of global government in action to you, I would struggle to say that you are wrong. If there is truly a cabal set on world domination and a global world order, then this would almost certainly be their planning arm. One of the group's primary founders, who served as their chairman until 1976, was Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. He was also a member of the Nazi Party and the SS as an officer until 1934. Is that relevant? I'll let you decide. He also worked in IG Farben's NW7 group that served as spies for the Third Reich and belonged to the Dutch branch of the Knights Templar, the Masonic order, even being appointed to govern the Dutch order. There are actually a lot of weird connections with Nazis, the Dulles brothers, yes, those Dulles brothers, and even Henry Kissinger, author of the book World Order and very vocal globalist, who once discussed a coup to overthrow the West German government in the 70s with a group of disgruntled Nazis. See, while Hitler and the Nazi Party lost their war efforts to unify Europe and eventually the world, not all of them simply just gave up their beliefs and moved on, found hobbies. There is a wealth of evidence to support that many simply hid their affiliations and went right back to work on their Fourth Reich through infiltration, subversion, and by affecting policy decisions in other places. That's a big rabbit hole for another day, though. For now, here's a brief rundown of a few of the similarly held beliefs between Bilderberg and the Nazis. They both advocate for highly centralized national governments, are deeply committed to globalization. Both believe in strict gun control for the general population, centralized government, controlled education, and the removal of organized religion, particularly Christianity, from public life. And both feel that they are the chosen elite of the world and are deeply committed to eugenics and population control. Not to say that they are Nazis by any means, just some interesting parallels and maybe some food for thought for you. The CFR actually functions as a steering committee for Bilderberg, as does our next group, one that also could easily slip in as another international organization and certainly functions as one on the surface. Oh, one more thing on Kissinger before I forget, and if you doubt any of what I've said so far, just take his word for it. In his 2014 World Order book that I mentioned a second ago, he states that, quote, "The old guard of the managerial elite needed to make way for the new tech elite. They would be the ones," he says, "who would bring the globalist project to fruition." Moving on. Functioning on the surface as a non-governmental internationalist organization, the Trilateral Commission, founded in July of 1973 by a banker and an internationalist globalist elite, let's not mince words here, David Rockefeller, gets put on this list not due to its secrecy, but due to its influence and cross-membership with many Bilderberg attendees and globalist elite. They are actually one of the least secretive groups that we've discussed. In fact, they're fairly open about their work to consolidate together the four primary centers of world power, those being political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical, into a world-spanning agenda that is superior to governments. They are without a doubt among the planning arm of this cabal, if there is one, so I couldn't leave them off of our list. Next up, we have a conspiracy theorist wet dream, and the boys' club we all love to hate, the Bohemian Grove. Bohemian Grove is technically the name of the 2,700-acre highly restricted campground in Monterey, California, belonging to the, quote, private gentlemen's club known as the Bohemian Club. Founded in 1878, the Bohemian Club meets every mid-July for a more than 2-week encampment of some of the world's most powerful men. Though originally started by journalists and entertainers and artists, it was quickly, shall we say, commandeered by prominent businessmen. While the club's motto, "Weaving spiders come not here," meaning to leave the outside world and business dealings at the door, basically, would lead you to think that it is simply a retreat for the rich and powerful. Many major decisions and events have been decided within this grove among the redwood trees. For example, it's common knowledge that the Manhattan Project planning took place there in September of 1942, which led to the atomic bomb. This is a matter of pride to members and is frequently relayed to new members as a brag whenever they join. The seal of the Bohemian Club is a Minerval owl, Minerval going back to the Roman goddess of wisdom, who held the owl as her sacred bird and was also a grade within the original Illuminati, by the way, the Minerval Academy, which served as a sort of entry point and recruitment level, one above novice. Low ranking in the scheme of things, but an integral foundation of the order. They both use the same ancient Athenian owl, just interesting for now. It likely doesn't only represent that, however. Lilith is also a strong co-contender, if you want to take it in that direction. Lilith was, of course, Adam's first wife, and later queen of the demons, and the great screeching owl mentioned in Isaiah 34:13 through 16, the night owl goddess that inhabits the ruins of Edom, which subsequently became a permanent element of Kabbalistic demonology. She is closely related to the Greek figure of Hecate, with her demands for human sacrifice, particularly children. Is it any coincidence, then, that the grove features a 40-foot owl statue that is the integral focal point of their mock human sacrifice ritual, the cremation of care? Still, others believe this statue symbolizes Moloch, a Canaanite deity associated with the practice of child sacrifice, which is also fitting as the subject of the cremation of care is the burning of an effigy that is roughly the size of a child or a very, very small adult. All of this comes into even more lucid focus when one takes into account in the 1980s, rumors of murders in remote parts of the grove became prominent. Local police and even state investigators were hindered at every turn, and their cases went nowhere, of course. More recent allegations have also begun to pile up of more than just unrestricted drunkenness, drug use, and homosexuality among its members, but much more serious accusations of kidnapping, rape, sodomy, and even ritual murder. The investigation is blocked under the 1947 National Security Act, of all things, and much like the Mark Dutroux scandal and the Omaha child abuse case, includes illegal detention of children. This particular rabbit hole goes incredibly deep and gets far darker, however, with much of the information either blocked completely or only stemming from alleged survivors. I can't in good conscience cover it very much further, or try to present it as fact. Only allegedly, okay? Don't come for me. It is at least common knowledge, or widely known perhaps, that members frequently leave at night to enjoy the company of the many prostitutes who come from around the world or are essentially shipped in for this event. While several significant moments have undoubtedly been decided or at least discussed within the grove, such as the atomic bomb and that time in 1967 when, over a drink, Ronald Reagan agreed to stay out of the coming presidential race to allow Richard Nixon to move forward instead. This isn't likely where major planning truly takes place with regular frequency, though. More likely, this is where networking and culling of those unwilling to play ball is much more prominent. To see who is willing to do the worst, or at least participate in activities either willingly or compelled, that would provide the blackmail needed to ensure future compliance. I can't truly tell you with any certainty what all happens at the Grove. I've never been, and I never would. But there are supposedly more than a few who have, and are more than willing to tell their stories. So I suppose that it's up to you who you choose to believe. There's no shortage of secret societies still in operation around the world, some far more secret than others. Some with far more power and resources, some that are seemingly, genuinely just civic-minded clubs with philanthropy at the heart of all that they do. Some that, at least now, seem to function as a form of graduated frat, providing a safe space for its members to get sloshed in private. They all, at their hearts at least, facilitate networking and building connections among other like-minded people, the effects of which varies from who wins the city's bid to build that new parking deck, all the way to shaping global agendas and consolidating power among the most powerful towards a shared common goal. These next two would certainly lean further into that second sort of outcome. The Skull and Bones Society, aka Brotherhood of Death, or simply Skull and Bones, or The Order, or Order 322, or Bones. a secret society that was founded, as we briefly discussed earlier, in 1832 at Yale University after a dispute among Yale debating societies over that season's Phi Beta Kappa awards, or so the story goes, by co-founders William Huntington Russell and Alphonso Taft. In 1856, Russell would incorporate it as the Russell Trust and later the Russell Trust Association, a tax-exempt association which hold possession of the Skull and Bones Hall at Yale University, as well as their holiday island, Deer Island. The order, much like Bohemian Grove, have a heavy influence of Greek traditions, common among fraternities and fraternal orders. While the 322 and their insignia has a wide array of explanations, Skull and Bones has never officially declared its significance to the public. Theories range from it being the year of Greek orator Demosthenes' death, to it being a reference to the Freemasonic Lodge of Virtue and Silence number 322 in Suffolk, UK, signaling a fraternal but unspoken sponsorship between the two secret societies and their shared value of silence being considered virtuous. Death is a leitmotif with the order, from their decor to their initiations and rituals. It's a common belief that they possess the stolen skulls of Martin Van Buren, Geronimo, and Pancho Villa, among others, that they keep and display within their Skull and Bones Hall, known as the Tomb, which is a vine-covered, windowless brownstone constructed in 1856, where to this day, bonesmen, as they are called, hold their occultish rites and meet together every Thursday and Sunday. The tomb was infiltrated on September 29th of 1876 by a group calling themselves the Order of File and Claw. They would reportedly find, among a vast array of macabre relics, Lodge Room 324, which was, quote, fitted up in black velvet from floor to ceilings, and upstairs they found Lodge Room 322, the Sanctum Sanctorum of the temple, furnished in red velvet with a large pentagram adorning one of its walls. The order, much like the Illuminati and Freemasons, proved quickly successful at gaining massive amounts of sway at the university through careful recruitment of its members in positions such as the editor of the school paper, students working in administration, leaders of other academic and athletic clubs, and particularly the wealthiest and most connected students coming from the most prominent families, and whomever necessary to continue to establish vertical and horizontal chains of influence to ensure the continuity of their dominance and furthering of their conspiratorial schemes. These seniors then go on to help each other to obtain high positions in banking, politics, business, and the like. The Bush family, going back to Prescott Bush, have been prominent members since the turn of the century to major investment bank firms Guaranty Trust and Brown Brothers Harriman, were both dominated by members of Skull and Bones. These two firms were also heavily involved in the financing of communism and the Nazis. Funding and political maneuvering by Bonesmen and their allies helped the Bolsheviks rise to power in Russia. As I've mentioned before, the order also has close ties to the CIA as well as its predecessor, the OSS. There were so many Yale alumni in the OSS that Yale's drinking tune, the Whiffenpoof song, was the unofficial song of the OSS, and many of them were Bonesmen. Gaddis Smith, a history professor at Yale, has stated that, quote, Yale has influenced the Central Intelligence Agency more than any other university, giving the CIA the atmosphere of a class reunion, and Bonesmen have been foremost among the spooks building the CIA's haunted house. End quote. Now for a wild one here, I just had to include. In Rodney Stitch's book, Defrauding America, he discusses a, quote, deep cover CIA officer, end quote, assigned to a counterintelligence unit codenamed Pegasus. This unit reportedly had tape recordings of plans to assassinate JFK, obtained from a wiretap on the phone of J. Edgar Hoover. The people on the tape were Nelson Rockefeller, Allen Dulles, Lyndon Johnson, Hoover, and George H.W. Bush. While researchers have long connected the CIA and Bush with the assassination, and there's a photo of a man that does look a suspicious amount like him there, he has always denied any involvement, of course. In 1963, Bush was living in Houston, working as the president of the Spada Offshore Oil Company, but many feel, myself included, that Bush was also pretty high up on the CIA ladder at this point already. When a note surfaced that was sent from J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI to a Mr. George Bush of the CIA would first state that they never commented on employment questions but then would later, under pressure, relent that yes, a George Bush was mentioned in that letter, but it was a different George Bush, not the one-day president. It is also worth noting this gem I found while researching Operation Northwoods and the Bay of Pigs invasion for the 9/11 series last season, but the CIA code word for the Bay of Pigs invasion was Operation Zapata, and 2 of the support vessels were named Barbara and Houston. Probably just a coincidence, right? What do I know? I've actually completed a fairly extensive and detailed list of these sort of, shall we say, coincidences. So let me know if you want a full-length Bush and Kennedy episode in the future. And for the record, all of that is backed up and scheduled along with the rest of my research to go out in the unlikely event that my dead man switch should ever come into play. So nobody get any bad ideas out there. Anyway, back to breaking bones, shall we? When a new member is initiated into Skull and Bones, they are given a new name, similar to the practice we discussed regarding the original Illuminati. Due to this fact and several other parallels, many feel that there is some degree of association between the two societies. Personally, I always felt it was probably reaching, but they are no less powerful and influential because of it. However, I have to concede that through this series we've seen how the Illuminati infiltrated and likely carried on within the upper levels of Freemasonry. So is it truly that great of a leap of logic to think that the order is in some way derived from them? Especially considering one of the founders, Taft's son, was a known Freemason, and while difficult to confirm, there is a good chance that he was as well. William Russell, the other founder, while not a confirmed Mason, did cite that he was inspired by the, quote, occult society that he had visited in Germany, as that was his inspiration for creating the order. The occult society that he speaks of is most likely the original Brotherhood of Death in Ingolstadt, Germany, which is an offshoot of Continental Freemason Baron von Hundt's strict observance rite, which had close associations with the Illuminati and Bavaria. What's very clear is that they at least both function in the same capacity, to work together to propel their members into powerful positions of leadership. The most successful come from old-line Puritan families, historically, and include Whitney, Lord, Phelps, Wadsworth, Allen, Bundy, Adams, Stinson, Taft, Gilman, and Perkins. The second group is comprised of Harriman, Rockefeller, Payne, Davidson, Pillsbury, Weyerhaeuser, and of course, Bush. So whether or not they are part of some grand conspiracy to rule the world and bring about the New World Order that Bush Sr. was so fond of talking about is truly impossible to prove. What can be said, though, at the very least, is that it is yet another notable example of the elite looking out for their own and working on and assuring their own mutual success. Next is where I would place the Freemasons. Since I've somewhat exhaustively covered them already, I won't go back through their history, rights, degrees, or any of that. So instead, let's talk about some symbolism that seems to keep popping up. Starting off with the inspiration for this series, and a hand sign you should all be familiar with. Number 1, the hidden hand. The Royal Arc degree, or the 13th degree of the Scottish Rite, also the 7th degree of the York Rite, a degree that is also known as the Mason of the Secret, as this is where the deeper meanings and true knowledge of the order is first made known to them. Part of the initiation ritual for this degree, which I won't go into detail here, it's long and pointless, is the passing of the initiates through a series of veils. Requirement to go through the second veil, or the sign of the master of the second veil as it is known, is the placing of one's typically right, but sometimes you'll see it as the left, hand inside of their jacket or waistcoat, supposedly calling back to Exodus 4:6 and a command given to Moses by God, where the heart, or bosom, I believe it's said actually in the Bible, stands for what we are, the hand for what we do. In other words, it could be said the meaning is, what we are is what we ultimately do. The long list of leaders and notable figures using this gesture runs the gamut from Napoleon through Washington to Stalin, and a long list of celebrities and politicians even today can be found using it. 2. The horned hand. While gaining popularity throughout the late 70s and 80s, and typically most people just think that it means rock and roll or rock on, whatever, the sign that's made by extending your pinky finger and index finger upwards or outwards, no, it's a slightly different variation, with the thumb pulling down on your middle finger and ring finger, is actually much older. Variations have been used in the Indian Hatha Yoga, the Buddhist Karana Mudra to expel demons and remove negative energy. This type of apotropic or protective magic usage was quite common for it for a long time in many cultures to ward off bad luck or like the evil eye. That was the big one that they would use in Italy and the Mediterranean. This is actually where it crossed over into heavy metal. Well, at least the most prominent example of it, I guess. I think it did exist a little bit before that, but Ronnie James Dio, he began using it, and he was claiming that he got it from his grandmother, who was Italian, so it would probably be that variation, that Malacchio, I think is what it's called there. And it's used against the evil eye. That's at least where it was popularized, and its use in music goes back further, though. Later, it would morph into devil horns. It's also, and perhaps more prominently used, as a sign of recognition between occult practitioners, and directed at a person as a sign of a curse. Anton LaVey, in a now famous interview promoting his Church of Satan, also spoke of it being used in that manner. You'll still see countless celebrities and politicians throwing it up, but maybe they're all just big metal fans or support Texas football. While we're talking about signs thrown around by celebrities, number 3, the hidden eye. I've touched on this before in the first episode of this season, actually, but I'm curious if since then, if you've come to notice just how prevalent its use truly is. I can't with confidence tell you if it's signaling the Eye of Horus or Providence and has Masonic or even Illuminati significance, or if it's allegiance to the occult, or just signifying being a part of a group that we aren't in. I can't prove any connections to monarch programming or really say with any certainty what it means. Opinions vary wildly and largely rest on speculation and hearsay. I can say there is a reason though, and I definitely feel that it is not good. I can go on and on in this vein, from the pyramid over the eye, the Rock Nation, whatever that's not. All of that, to the 666 hand gesture okay thing for days. But ultimately, it would all just be historical uses and guesses at why it's still being used now. I'm not someone to just jump on and repeat, particularly on this podcast, any speculatory and unverifiable, just straight up conspiracy theories and present them as facts, which prevents me from really getting too much further into this part. There does, however, seem to be a pattern, and as someone who prides himself on having a fairly acute sense, trained over decades of pattern recognition, I've felt it was all at least worth mentioning to you. Part 3. Addendum. How the global elite, governments, kings and queens, and institutions became intertwined together, and so many drawn to the occult, can be summed up fairly succinctly by the 19th century British politician Lord Acton when he said, "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely," which conveys the opinion that as one's power increases, their moral sense diminishes. While he was most likely referencing the monarchy of the time, it's an axiom that still seems to ring true in far more cases than not, and can be traced back through history as far back as we know or remember. Those who would seek power, particularly over an entire civilization or even industry, will almost always crave more of that power, more of that control, and quite often will be willing to go to unimaginable lengths and sink to lower and lower depths in order to obtain it. In the same way that the ultra-wealthy tend to never just wake up one day and say, well, I have more than I could ever need now, and more than I or my children's children could ever spend, I think I'll just stop trying to get more money. The same can be said for power. It takes a certain degree of hubris to start with for someone to believe that they are, for whatever reason, exalted above others and best qualified to be in charge of them. Often, especially in the past, it required a more excessive show of force and violence in order to obtain it. The ruler was the one who was willing to physically assert their will upon others, either personally or through the financing of an army of some sort. One must first thirst for power to obtain it. There are few notable, rare exceptions, of course. Marcus Aurelius comes to mind. They were chosen by others or had that authority thrust upon them without any desire to obtain it first. Historically, Ancient rulers would keep some form of magician, witch, or occultist in their court, being drawn to their professed abilities of granting additional power through esoteric means, power otherwise inaccessible to the rulers. Perhaps over time they simply started to learn those ways in an effort to cut out the middleman, so to speak, and concentrate that power too onto themselves. As far as the global elite of today goes, aside from so many being descended from those earlier occultish rulers and traditions passed down through generations as a means of growing and maintaining their power and fortunes, it would seem at least a lot of it can be traced back to a shared following. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Western world would see a rather sudden open resurgence of occultism, spiritualism, and a hunger for the once seemingly forgotten esoteric knowledge of the old world. While most people were too busy and tired, too distracted by working long hours and raising families, just trying to get by and survive, to give it all that much thought in any practical way, the elite of the time, unburdened by those menial affairs, would have plenty of time and the means to jump in with both feet. The rise of theosophy was underway and seen as trendy among elite circles, setting the stage for what would come to be called as the New Age spiritualism movement. One of its primary drivers was a small group of obscure academics led, at least in part, by a woman named H.P. Blavatsky. They were obsessed with esoteric beliefs, Gnosticism, and even satanic practices and rituals. She would co-found the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, claiming she had a psychic connection to beings that she called the Mahatmas, or the Masters, who she claimed helped her write the foundational books on theosophy, including The Secret Doctrine. I mention this because this movement was primarily an elitist one, and the spread of occultism in the early 1900s seemed to specifically target the upper classes. This would result in many financial and political leaders becoming involved in private, obscure organizations with secretive mandates and practices. While everyone from Rosicrucians and Freemasons to the alchemists of the Middle Ages held some occult beliefs, they were mostly kept hidden, out of sight, and in coded texts. Theosophists, on the other hand, were progressively so, much more public in their efforts. Though theosophy was outwardly apolitical, at least to start with, arguing against political intrusion into people's lives. This would shift over time, as the once Christian and conservative politicians would become progressively separated from those long-held tenets and begin to truly exercise the separation of church and state in their personal and political lives. With this, the theosophist interest in controlling government grew, and the movement turned more socialist in practice. These new spiritual systems revolved around pagan deities and ancient mystery religions of the past, with roots in Babylonian, ancient Egyptian, and Assyrian beliefs and practices. There was also a focus on one other figure in particular, that being the light bearer, the angel of light, the morning star, or as you may be more familiar, the serpent, Satan, the devil, or his Enochian angelic name, Lucifer. Modern-day Luciferians will frequently deny that the name Lucifer has anything to do with the biblical Satan, but even Blavatsky herself treats the two as synonymous. In her Secret Doctrine work, one quote from it is, quote, "And now it stands proven that Satan, or the red fiery dragon, the Lord of Phosphorus, and Lucifer, or Light-bearer, is in us. It is our mind." End quote. There are tons of other examples, but I didn't enjoy skimming it for this research, much less do I want to repeat any more of it to you. In our modern day, many people will say, who cares if that's what they believe? It's all mythical mumbo-jumbo and hoodoo anyway to me, and you, or they, are perfectly entitled to feel that way, and to doubt the reality of any or all of it. I would tell you that the vast majority of the elite, in particular the globalists, feel it is very, very real though. It matters, but don't you think the deeply held religious beliefs of those with all the political and financial power affects how they make decisions, form alliances, and above all, how far they will go and what means they will use to grow and maintain that power, influence, and control? For example, we spoke earlier about the UN. It's fairly common knowledge that the UN building in New York has an extensive occult library, but it's much less common knowledge that it was built by a group called Lucifer Publishing Company, which would later change its name to Lucis Trust. Lucis Trust frequently cites the writings of H.B. Blavatsky as inspiration for their organization. It was founded by Alice and Foster Bailey, both big fans of Theosophy. Alice was actually one of the first writers to coin the term New Age, and one of the founders of the Pacific Grove Lodge, where she worked in esoteric studies and taught classes in Theosophy. There's a lot with these two actually, but for the sake of time, let's go on. Essentially, Theosophists, like Luciferians, view Lucifer as a misunderstood hero figure, unjustly slandered by Christianity, who only tried to bring knowledge to mankind. The ultimate goal of their philosophy is essentially to pursue hidden knowledge until mankind, or a select few at least, become gods. This is a driving factor in why the globalists are so obsessed with transhumanism, or the merger of technology and AI with humanity to create a greater being. Only in their future, they would become the greater beings, or those able to purchase their ascension. For everyone else, it would look a whole lot more like some brave new world state technology to more effectively control the masses, restrict movement, and efficiently comatose, if you will, the public into complacency, rendering them unable or unwilling to ever form any sort of meaningful resistance, regardless of what is done to them. While that is admittedly, at this point, a dystopic glimmer in the eye of the global elite, I have very little doubt that it is, at very least, frighteningly similar to the agenda they seem so hard at work on and dead set on achieving. Returning back to the globalist beliefs, do they actually believe in a real devil, like with horns and hooves and a pitchfork? I don't know. I doubt it. What's important from all of that, though, is the philosophical goal of their cultism to convince a majority of the population, what's left after they get those numbers down anyway, I guess, that there is no good or evil. Everything is subjective, everything is empty, and above all, everything is relative to momentary demands, their demands, of course. While we are in this neighborhood of discussion, let me make a quick distinction that will no doubt ruffle the feathers of any lower degree Freemason who may one day hear this. While you know and have been told that Masons believe in the, quote, great architect of the universe, and you must believe in a supreme being to join, and they outwardly claim that the G in their compass is a symbol for geometry, or equally cited that it stands for God, famous Grand Masons like Albert Pike and Eliphas Levi have stated and written it multiple times that it stands for gnosis, meaning knowledge, and generation. Generation in a biblical sense could mean genetics or bloodline. Both actually come from sacred words of the Cabal, not the Bible. The Cabal is an esoteric method or discipline within Jewish mysticism concerning spiritual works and symbol magics, and, as some believe, an aim towards imbuing the student with prophetic abilities. Masonic writing tend to dwell heavily on the descendant of Ham being one of the founders of Masonry, that being Nimrod. Nimrod had many things attributed to him, and several names in scripture such as Chemosh, Moloch, Morodach, Remphan, Tammuz, his son, and Baal, just to name a few. Did you catch Moloch in there? Or Baal? Just checking. Albert Pike is quoted in his instructions to the 23 Supreme Councils of the world the following: "That which we must say to the crowd is, we worship a God, but it is the God one adores without superstition. To you, Sovereign Grand Inspector General, we say this, and you may repeat it to the brethren of the 32nd, 31st, and 30th degrees. The Masonic religion should be by all of us initiates of the high degrees maintained in the purity of the Luciferian doctrine." Going on to say, yes, Lucifer is God. He then goes on to say how Lucifer is God of light and God of good, and the Christian God, whom they call Adonai, is who he is struggling against, and that he is truly the God of darkness and evil, not Lucifer. Pike is only one very vocal example of these beliefs within Masonry, though. There are tons more examples of that. And if you're a Mason and you didn't know any of this, or never read up on Albert Pike, and I'm sorry to have to be the one to bear that news to you. but it might be something that you should look into if you truly do have Christian intentions with it, shall we say. Pike is a very interesting character and a personification of evil. He was also very vocal about their plans and goals. One being where he predicted a World War III scenario where the New World Order would pit Zionism against Islam, and called for unleashing the nihilists and atheists to provoke a great social cataclysm, leading to Christianity being turned and, quote, receiving the true light through the universal manifestation of Lucifer, finally brought out into public view, causing the mutual assured destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. Just saying, maybe they aren't quite the God-fearing, civic-minded, good guy fraternal order that many are led to believe. So, if any low-level mid-masons do hear this, I just ask you to be very, very sure about what you are really getting into. Part 4. Conclusions. I set out at the start of this series, as I always do, to seek the truth. I had hopes of fully revealing the truth of all of this and how the Cabal really functions, with aims of disproving any notion of an ancient, grand, overarching conspiracy needing to be in play for its outcome to remain the same. To illustrate how no conspiracy was needed for similar interests to coalesce around wealth and power, as they always have, and work without agreement towards their mutual best interests. I wanted to debunk the Illuminati having continued in any form and finally kill the air of power, mystery, and unbridled control that has so long been credited to them. I wanted to stay away from what I suspected to be nothing more than superstition and slander regarding satanic worship and occult dealings among the global elite, and show that their true and only religion was worship of the almighty dollar. In the end, I feel like I have done parts of these things, but what I ended up uncovering was in fact far worse than I had ever imagined, and at times would rock me to my core. In some cases, made me extremely angry, and in others, deeply disturbed. If I had to break it all down in some sort of summary, I guess I could say that a few very wealthy families took control of global finance and industry long ago. Over time, their tentacles spread out to slowly engulf all facets of our lives through media, healthcare, education, agriculture, and of course, commerce. While I can't really prove or disprove the existence of a grand unified conspiracy behind it all, I feel I can, and hopefully have, shown how, if there is a grand conspiracy, it is being achieved in a practical sense. How people, even those who start with good intentions, are manipulated, extorted, corrupted, and controlled into service of this agenda. How entire nations are compelled to serve the interests of the few at the cost of the many. How their deeds are concealed, dissent is squashed, perceptions are carefully controlled, and mistakes are covered up. How events are orchestrated, lies are sold, truths are hidden. Above all, how if we don't collectively wake up and start paying some attention, realize that our common goals and needs drastically outweigh any of our perceived and contrived differences, and come to recognize that we are being systematically divided and set against one another, while our true enemy is getting exactly what they want and need from that division, then it is only a matter of time before we are swept away by the true monolithic force which opposes all of us: greed. I can't tell you if what we're seeing is the result of some Bavarian elitist playing a very long game, or just what happens when the corruption of power is allowed to run amok completely unchecked. I can't say if the New World Order started in Bavaria or in America in 1976, but I can tell you that I have very little doubt that we are standing on the cusp of its ultimate realization today, regardless of how intentional or unintentional that process to get us here has been. While I have always tried to present, as best I can, some degree of solutions to the problems that I bring up, I have to be honest with you in saying that there are no simple, quick, or easy ways for us to step back from this particular ledge. That isn't to say all hope is lost, or that it isn't possible, just that it will take some serious work on all of our parts, and it's going to have to start with choosing unity over division and facing uncomfortable truths over soothing deceptions. Since this is already easily my longest episode yet, I'll give more of my thoughts on all of this topic on the next BTR, hopefully next week. And I apologize again that it has taken so long to wrap this series up. But as you have heard, there was quite a bit left that needed to be addressed. Thank you as always for joining me on this journey through the truth about the hidden hand. I hope that you learned at least a little bit, or found a way through all this heavy material to find a degree of entertainment in it. Admittedly, it became a much heavier subject than even I realized it would be when I set out to do this. Stay safe out there, friends. Keep your head up and your hearts hopeful till we meet again. And I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.